The occasion of Chinese New Year allows us the opportunity to consider Chinese religion and how it can inspire us ethically and spiritually. In our adult RE program that I've been leading for the last, we've had 3 of 6 sessions, and we're studying the 6 sources of UU kind of spiritual and theological framework that people have, and one is world religions, which inspire us, as it says, in our spiritual and ethical lives. So today we'll consider in particular Chinese religion. I will touch briefly on the origins of Chinese religion, on some of its recurrent themes, and on how insights gleaned from these sources can be constructively applied to our lives, and finally a little bit on the New Year's celebrations themselves, their intention and their promise. As today's service is intergenerational, we've divided up my remarks into 4 shorter than usual segments, so it's not too, talky for the youth and for the grown-ups. China is an ancient land with ancient traditions. Religiously and culturally, China can be seen as continually oscillating between 2 poles: the down-to-earth humanism of Confucianism and the transcendental mysticism of the Taoists. Both traditions claim their beginnings 2.5 millennia ago. 6th century BCE China was a period of social and political turmoil. The old imperial order of the Zhou dynasty was breaking down. Small and intermediate-sized states vied for power and authority. Into this situation came Confucius, an oft-thwarted office seeker. Despite traveling for many years, offering his services to one magistrate after another, he was mostly unsuccessful at securing any kind of permanent or secure employment until he quit seeking government appointments and became instead a teacher. His name was actually Kangxi, Latinized into Confucius 2,000 years later by Jesuit missionaries. After his death in 479 BCE, works purporting to record the dialogues, teachings, and biological narratives of Kangxi's life appeared, the most clearly authentic of which, the Analects, will be quoted a little later in this morning's reading. So 479 BC, he died. Well, 480 BC, Aeschylus, I think, or Euripides was born, one of them. And Thermopylae, the great battle of the Greeks defeating Xerxes and the Persians. So you get an idea. It's really the very beginnings of Greek culture, and it was kind of the grounding after a period of great turmoil in China of their culture. Well, the Analects is the compilation of Confucius' teachings. Now, Confucianism is both a religion and a system of social and ethical philosophy. It is not at all like most Western religions with their revealed doctrines about God. Confucius was both a humanist and a reflective philosopher. His teaching is both practical and open to the transcendental order of reality. He probes the nature of relationships and the cultivation of virtue, both of which have a bearing on political leadership. While there's no single theme to the Analects, many of its chapters have Confucius exhorting his followers regarding 2 noble ideals: benevolence and ritual piety. Benevolence is sensitivity to the personhood of others, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and being sensitive to that in all your interactions. Ritual piety, decorously regulating one's speech and deportment. It's like holding your tongue, deferring to your superiors, your elders, your ancestors, and so on. The two virtues are actually intimately linked, almost one and the same. Thus, Confucius tells his disciple Yan Quan to control oneself and return to ritual propriety is to act with benevolence. The Analects is mainly concerned with the application of ritual and ethics in public life. Throughout its pages, Confucius examines and re-examines the motives and conduct of his disciples, from their preparation for an official career through their years of official service.
So as Reverend Stephen told you, this reading today is from the Analects by Confucius. And this is what he wrote. When Zhu Lu, Zheng His, Yan Yu, and Kung Hsua were seated in attendance, the master, Confucius, said, "Do not feel constrained simply because I am a little older than you are. You are in the habit of saying, 'My abilities are not appreciated.' But if someone did appreciate your abilities, do tell me how you would go about things." Zhu Lu promptly answered, "If I were to administer a state of 1,000 chariots situated between powerful neighbors, troubled by armed invasions and by repeated famines, I could, within 3 years, give the people courage and a sense of direction. Chu, what about you? If I were to administer an area measuring 60 or 70 li square, or even 50 or 60 li square, I could, within 3 years, bring the size of the population up to an adequate level. As to the rites and music, I would leave that to an abler gentleman. Chia, how about you? I do not say that I already have the ability, but I am ready to learn. On ceremonial occasions in the ancestral temple or in diplomatic gatherings, I should like to assist as a minor official in charge of protocol, properly dressed in my ceremonial cap and robes. Tian, how about you? After a few dying notes, came the final chord, and then he stood up from his lute. I differ from the other 3 in my choice. The master said, "What harm is there in that? After all, each man is stating what he has set his heart upon." Jian said, "In late spring, after the spring clothes have been newly made, I should like, together with 5 or 6 adults and 6 or 7 boys, to go bathing in the river He and enjoy the breeze on the rain altar, and then go home chanting poetry." The master sighed and said, "I am in favor of Jian."
If the ethical humanism of Confucianism is one pole of Chinese culture, the naturalistic mysticism of Taoism is the other. Taoism's roots lie in the pre-literate native religion of Chinese antiquity. It was not written down until the 4th century BCE in the form of the Tao Te Ching, ascribed to Lao Tzu, which is Chinese for old master. According to traditions, Lao Tzu was a contemporary of Confucius, a librarian who, weary of the world and ready to retire, set off for the western mountains. And when he came to the gate to the mountain pass, the gatekeeper saw somehow that he was a wise man. He said, "Oh, you can't leave. We need your wisdom." And he said, "Oh, no, I'm out of here." And he said, well, then write down your wisdom and bequeath it to us. And so, persuaded by the gatekeeper to do so before he left, the sage returned 3 days later with 81 aphoristic poems, the Tao Te Ching. This morning's meditation, which I'll read a little later, Mystic Unity, is one of them. Now, the Tao, we know that symbol, kind of yin-yang symbol, and people talk about Tao. Tao is not God. It's more primal than God. The source from whence all gods and everything else arise. Tao Te Ching means the way and its power. Tao is the primal pattern of reality, the primary program, the natural order and flow of the universe. Taoists believe there's no supernatural world, only the natural world. And Tao, symbolized by these kind of interlocking tadpoles, black and white, that's the pattern. Nature is always changing. Nevertheless, Tao is kind of like the symbol of the cycle of the sun. It remains the same always, operating as yin and yang, day following night, following day, following night. Yin and yang symbolize universal polarities, pairs of opposites recognizable everywhere throughout the natural world, negative and positive, male and female, light and dark, good and evil, earth and heaven. Tao is the implicit unity antecedent to all categories. Yin and yang are the explicit duality seen in our lives. They thoroughly permeate the sensible world. For Lao Tzu and his successors, Tao is the natural order of things. Tao is that from which one cannot deviate. That from which you can deviate is not Tao. Ordinary mind is Tao. Ordinary, yet subtle and elusive. Tao is like water, surrounding and flowing through all things. The human order, the order of society, concerned as it is with failure and success, deviates and falls out of sync. On this, Taoists and Confucius tend to agree. Much of what passes for the meritorious conduct in the world is, in fact, pretense and posturing. Indeed, as soon as folks start talking about morality, true virtue is, by and large, a thing of the past. The louder a person decries immorality in public, the more likely they are to indulge in it privately. As it says in the Tao Te Ching, in the degradation of the great way came benevolence and righteousness. With the exaltation of learning and prudence comes immense hypocrisy. The disordered family is full of dutiful children and parents. The disordered society is full of patriots. Confucius concurs. True virtue is modest and heartfelt and never calls attention to itself. This is why he commends Tien, the flutist, for stating honestly what his heart was set upon, swimming with friends and children and then singing together as they walk home. If we were all so down to earth, society would be better off, and all of us within it. Chinese culture, then, can be thought of as a 2,500-year oscillation between two polarities, the outer-directed social ethics of Confucius and the inner-directed stillness of Lao Tzu. In a way, they're sort of the yin and yang of Chinese tradition. Neither alone suffices. Chinese religion understands this. Indeed, each tradition includes the other within itself, just as the dark yin includes a dot of white and the white yang a dot of the dark. True spirituality always includes both ethics and insight. Unshackled by the Aristotelian dualism of the West, when I say that, according to Aristotle, something's either A or not A, but it can never be both at the same time. It has to either be black or white. But the Chinese is not shackled by Aristotle. They never paid any attention to Aristotle. They'd never even heard of him. So it always has embraced this both and understanding of life. Belatedly, the West is catching up. For instance, modern physics understands light as both waves and particles, and neither description alone can explain it. To understand light, we need to think both and, not either or. So it is with China and with reality itself. I'm convinced that seeing reality through a both and yin-yang lens is central to spiritual insight and ultimately to our global health and future. This goes far beyond China. Consider, for instance, Unitarian Universalism. To fully appreciate our tradition, it seems to me one has to balance the rational, thought-centered Unitarianism with Universalism's emphasis on growing our hearts and souls. Even within the Unitarian tradition, the deism of Jefferson and Adams became, by the 1830s, too much of a head trip, until balanced by the intuitive, romantic counterweight that was transcendentalism. We need both if we want to get a full grasp on life and human destiny and promise, or so it seems to me. Head and heart, ethics and insight, science and faith. Life, after all, is dynamic and in constant transformation. Living life fully and honestly and virtuously requires appreciating the tension between its opposite poles, riding that tension and integrating it into how we see the world and how we behave within the world and how we treat one another. Around the beginning of the Common Era, that is around the year 0, Buddhism entered China. Buddhism started in India about 600 BC, 500 some. It took about 600 years to Bodhidharma, this legendary missionary who brought Buddhism to China. It intermingled with what it found there until, by the 700s, there were 3 religions, each of which incorporated aspects of the other 2, so Taoism, Confucianism, and now Buddhism. This was the period of the Tang Dynasty, an era of beautiful art, music, and poetry, and of stable government. By the turn of the first millennium, Chinese, or Chan Buddhism, had been transformed, exported to Japan over the next many centuries, it became Zen. That which remained in China had, by the 12th century, merged into a Neo-Confucianistic amalgam. It has been more or less the same ever since. Indeed, recent government-sponsored surveys on spirituality in China have found the number of traditional religious believers among the country's nearly 1.4 billion people far higher than previously believed, and amounting, despite communism's official atheism, to as many as 300 million people. It's interesting, in the history of China, periodically there's a new dynasty, and the Chinese communists aren't the first people to outlaw religion. The first official Chinese autocrats to make religion illegal. It's happened about 5 times. It's gone on for many generations. And then every time when it ends, before long, all those sacred texts which were burned and banned turn up again. One of the reasons Americans traditionally have loved the Chinese, I suspect, is because they're so down to earth. Take the idea of life after death. Confucius was once queried on the subject. Tzu Lu asked how one should serve ghosts and spirits. This is, again, from the Analects. The master said, "Till you have learned how to serve men, how can you possibly serve ghosts?" Tzu Lu then ventured upon a question about death and about the dead people. Till you know about the living, how are you to know about the dead? Likewise, consider Dongpu Jusi, honored as a Neo-Confucian poet and sage. It is said that once, during his free time, Su Zhengpo decided out of boredom to make some stew. An old friend visited him, and in the middle of the cooking, and challenged him to a game of Chinese checkers. Su totally forgot his stew until a very fragrant smell came up from the kitchen, reminding him. Thus, Dongpu's pork, a famous dish in Chinese cuisine, was discovered by a philosopher and completely by accident. Valuing earthiness means that Chinese religion acknowledges so-called feminine virtues and attributes equally, and feminine virtues and attributes equally with those typically thought of as masculine. Thus we read in the Tao Te Ching, "The valley spirit never dies. Call it the mystery, the woman. The mystery, the door of the woman, is the root of earth and heaven. Forever this endures, forever, and all its uses are easy. Male and female, light and dark, active and passive, all is in flux and in constant transformation, churning effortlessly into the continuous birth and death and renewal of the ineffable Tao. Still, there is naturally such a thing as ascendancy, and there is also degeneration. Such is the nature of all things, including governments and dynasties. So it is that each successive dynasty put serious energy into propitiating religious authorities and gaining their spiritual imprimatur. An all-powerful ministry of rites determined the dates of ceremonial observances. The Chinese calendar combines lunar and solar calculations, but the lunar cycle is the more important. After all, the waxing and waning of the moon is obvious to anyone. Solstices and equinoxes less so. Nevertheless, both are important because of their connection to the dominant and recessive phases of yin and yang, both cosmically and internally within one's heart.